The Aelorian calendar marked 14 months in cycles of 32 days, which meant that by Alina's private accounting, she had eaten breakfast across from David approximately 440 times. She had counted once, during a particularly quiet morning when the diplomatic correspondence had been light, and his presence across the table had felt less like company, and more like a variable in an equation she could not quite solve. 440 breakfasts. She knew how he took his tea without sugar, with a patience that seemed directed at the tea itself, as though he was giving it time to decide what it wanted to be. She knew he read the morning intelligence reports in order of region, east to west, for reasons he had explained once, and she had not retained because she had been too occupied noticing that he explained things without any apparent need for her to be impressed by them. She knew the small scar along his left jaw that he'd received, according to a security file she had read before the wedding and not mentioned since, in a border engagement 7 years prior. She knew all of this the way one knows the specifications of a ship, accurately, completely, and without any particular sense of what it would feel like to be aboard one in difficult weather. The Velorn summit had been her initiative. 3 planetary delegations, 1 disputed resource corridor, and enough accumulated diplomatic tension to make the journey there feel like carrying something fragile across an uneven floor. Her advisors had run the probability models twice. The corridor between the outer settlements and Velorn Citadel was stable, the models said. The models, Alina had noted privately, had been built by people who believed that stability was a condition of geography rather than of will. David had said nothing about the journey except to ask, on the evening before departure, whether she preferred the eastern route or the coastal pass. She had said eastern. He had nodded and arranged it without further discussion, and she had spent a brief, irritating moment appreciating his efficiency before reminding herself that efficiency was a functional quality and not a personal one. The carriage itself was Aelorian design, low profile, signal dampened, with a hull composite that her engineering minister had described using 17 words she understood perfectly, and one metaphor she had found oddly charming. It moved quietly. Through the narrow viewport, the eastern landscape was the color of old bronze in the late afternoon light, and Alina sat with a data slate across her knees and the very deliberate intention of reading it. David sat opposite her. He had a similar data slate. He was, as far as she could determine, actually reading his. "You've read that page 4 times, he said, without looking up. Alina looked at him. "I read slowly." "You read the Corvin trade annexes in 11 minutes. All 40 pages. Those were interesting." He looked up then, and there was something in the expression, not quite a smile, more the structural suggestion of one, that she found more difficult to categorize than she would have preferred. "The Eastern Highland soil composition report isn't interesting. It has its moments," she said, and returned to the slate with the precise energy of someone who has just conceded a minor point and intends to give no further ground. Outside, the bronze light was deepening. The carriage passed through a monitoring checkpoint, a brief handshake of encrypted signals between the hull and the station beacon, logged and cleared in the time it took Alina to turn a page she had not read. The settlement clusters were thinning now, giving way to the open corridor, and the quiet had the particular quality of quiet that exists in spaces designed for transit rather than habitation. Functional quiet. The kind with no opinion about you. She was formulating a response to the 3rd delegation's amendment proposal, restructuring it in her mind with the same methodical patience she applied to everything, when David set down his slate. Not with any urgency, just set it down. "We're being followed," he said. Alina looked up. His tone was the same as the tone he used to observe that the tea was ready. She glanced at the rear display on the carriage's navigation panel, a secondary screen she had not been monitoring because the security detail was supposed to be monitoring it, and saw 2 craft running without transponders against the low ridge to the east. "How long," she asked, "since the checkpoint?" She considered this. You didn't say anything. I was waiting to see if they'd peel off. And he picked up his data slate again, looked at it briefly and set it back down. They're not peeling off. Alina straightened in her seat, pressed the internal comm for her head of security, and was 3 words into a calm and thorough set of instructions when the carriage stopped. The stopping was not gradual. The carriage's drive system cut with the abruptness of something interrupted rather than concluded, and for a half-second, the signal-dampening hull produced a silence so complete it had texture. Then the outside noise arrived. Not an explosion, nothing so singular, but a layered, overlapping collection of sounds that Alina's mind sorted with the automatic efficiency of someone who had grown up in a palace, where knowing the difference between ceremonial and emergency was a survival skill. Weapons discharge, multiple sources, close. Her head of security's voice came through the comm in fragments, cut through with interference, and Alina's hand was already on the secondary lock panel before she had consciously decided to move. The carriage's internal systems flickered, a sweep of amber across the status display, the navigation screen going briefly dark before the backup array engaged. Someone outside was running a disruption field. Broad spectrum, imprecise, the kind of technology that suggested adequate funding and insufficient patience. David was no longer sitting down. She registered this the way she registered most things about him, accurately, with a slight delay in interpretation. He had moved to the forward interior panel, and was doing something to it with a focus that was entirely different in quality from his usual focus, which was calm in the way that still water is calm. This was calm in the way that a calculation is calm, purposeful in a direction she did not yet have the angle to see. "Stay in the carriage," he said. Alina looked at him. "I am a queen." "Yes." He pulled something from the panel housing that she recognized after a moment as a secondary pulse emitter, standard installation in diplomatic vehicles, not standard knowledge among most diplomatic passengers. "That's why I said it." She opened her mouth to respond to this with the measured authority it deserved, and he was already at the door. It opened and closed behind him with a sound like a decision being finalized, and then Alina was alone in the carriage with the amber status lights and the interference-broken comm and the viewport. She moved to the viewport, the rational part of her mind, which was most of her mind, most of the time, and which she had always considered one of her more reliable features. Noted that watching through a reinforced viewport was not the same as being outside, and that remaining inside a signal-dampened, hull-composite carriage was objectively the correct strategic choice for a diplomatic principle under ambush conditions. She noted this clearly and continued watching. There were 6 of them. She counted automatically. They had positioned well 2 at the front of the carriage, 2 covering the ridge approach, 2 managing what appeared to be a portable disruption array mounted on a ground vehicle that had come up from the Dry Creek bed to the east. The positioning was professional. The equipment was good. Someone had spent real resources on this and had spent them carefully, which told her things she would file and examine later when there was a later. David moved into her line of sight, and she found, to her own annoyance, that she had been holding her breath. What happened next was difficult to describe, not because it was chaotic, but because it wasn't. That was the part her mind kept returning to in the seconds and minutes that followed, with the persistent attention of something that doesn't know where to put itself. It was not chaotic. It was sequential. He moved through the 6 of them with a kind of economy that had no interest in being impressive. No unnecessary motion, no pauses for effect. The pulse emitter used twice, and then set aside when it became more efficient to use other methods. And through all of it, that expression, or rather that absence of expression, steady and unremarkable and entirely itself. The 2 at the front went first. The disruption array went second, which was tactically correct, and which Alina noted with the distant appreciation of someone watching a chess move they hadn't anticipated but immediately understand. There was a moment, 30 seconds in, perhaps, When one of the ambushers said something that her viewport's audio pickup caught poorly, the words dissolving in interference, and David responded. She couldn't hear what he said. The man sat down on the ground and did not get up, and one of his colleagues took 3 steps backward, which seemed like a reasonable response. At the 2-minute mark, she became aware that she was standing with both hands pressed flat against the viewport housing and made herself stop doing that. At 3 minutes, 2 of the remaining ambushers made a coordinated decision to leave, which she suspected they would spend considerable time regretting for reasons of professional reputation rather than physical consequence, since David let them go with the complete indifference of someone who has already moved on to the next item on a list. At 4 minutes there was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows something, dense with the shape of what preceded it. Alina straightened. She smoothed the front of her diplomatic coat with both hands, which was not something she normally did and which she would not be examining further. The comm crackled once and her head of security's voice came through in full, no longer fragmented, reporting a status she had already observed through the viewport. The door opened. David stood in the frame. The late bronze light was behind him. His expression was the same as every morning over breakfast, the same as it had been when he noted the Eastern craft, the same as it had been when he asked about her route preference the evening before, the same as it had apparently been through all 4 minutes of what she had just watched through the viewport. He extended his hand. Alina looked at it for a moment. She took it. She did not let go quickly, and neither of them said anything about that. The road to Velorn Citadel resumed as though it had not been interrupted, which Alina found either admirable or absurd depending on which part of her mind she consulted. The carriage drive system re-engaged. The navigation screen returned to its steady display of route and distance. Outside, the bronze light had shifted toward something cooler, the eastern ridge now a dark line against a sky that had begun its slow negotiation with evening. The disruption array was a collapsed shape in the dry creek bed. The security detail had secured the 3 remaining ambushers with an efficiency that suggested they had been waiting for something useful to do. Alina sat. David sat. The data slates were still on their respective seats, where they had been left, and there was something faintly comic about that. The careful, ordinary objects arranged exactly as they had been before 4 minutes had rearranged several other things. She did not pick hers up. He did not pick his up either, which she noted without comment. The comm traffic was steady now, her security chief running post-engagement protocol in the professional, thorough manner Alina had hired her for. Sweep of the surrounding terrain. Encrypted report to the capital. Medical assessment of the detail, 2 minor injuries, neither serious, both already complaining about the paperwork. Alina responded to each update with the practiced calm of someone who gives instructions the way other people breathe, and through all of it was aware, with a precision she found inconvenient, that David was watching her do it. Not intrusively, not with the particular attention that requires acknowledgement, simply watching, the way he sometimes watched things, the way she had noticed him watching the morning intelligence reports, or the eastern landscape through the viewport, as though the act of observation was itself a complete and satisfying thing. She finished the last update and set the comm down. "You knew about the secondary panel," she said. "It's in the vehicle specification document. Most people don't read vehicle specification documents." "I read vehicle specification documents," he said, in a tone that managed to be both entirely serious and somehow the funniest thing she had heard all week, which she addressed by looking out the viewport. The Citadel was still 2 hours out by the navigation display's estimate. 2 hours of corridor road, signal station checkpoints, the particular suspension of normal time that exists between one significant thing and the next. Alina had spent a great deal of her life in that suspension. She was good at it. She filled it with work and analysis and the forward motion of agenda items, and it served her well and had never once felt like what it actually was, which was waiting. She was aware that something had shifted in the carriage's particular atmosphere and was choosing, with great deliberation, not to examine it directly. The hand. The not letting go. These were data points that she had placed in a file she was not currently opening. The ambush was professional, she said instead, because this was true and relevant and safely analytical. Yes. The disruption array was Corvin manufacture, modified. He looked at her with something that might have been appreciation. You got that from the viewport. I got the housing configuration from the viewport. The modification pattern was a reasonable inference from the sweep signature. She paused. The third delegation's amendment proposal suddenly seems less procedural. That occurred to me too. When? Approximately at the checkpoint, he said, when I noticed the craft. The array model was confirmation. Elena considered this. He had known, or suspected, for the full length of their conversation about soil composition reports. He had sat there with his data slate and his not-quite smile, and his observation about her reading habits while carrying a working tactical assessment, and had said nothing about it until he was certain, because certainty. She was revising several things about him in real time and filing them carefully, was apparently the threshold he required before speaking. You could have mentioned it earlier, she said. You were working. I was reading a soil report. You were thinking, he said. You used the slate as a surface to think against. I didn't want to interrupt before I was sure. The silence that followed this was a different quality of silence than any they had shared in 440 breakfasts. Elena was aware of this with the same precision with which she was aware of most things, which was to say completely, and with nowhere comfortable to put it. Outside, the first signal station checkpoint passed, the brief encrypted handshake, the cleared status, the steady green on the navigation display. The sky had completed its negotiation with evening and arrived at something definitive, the stars beginning their appearance with the unhurried confidence of things that have been there all along. Elorian stars looked different from the ones above her home settlement, the constellations rearranged by distance into unfamiliar shapes, and she had spent 14 months occasionally looking at them, with the feeling of reading a language she almost knew. The three they captured, David said. They'll have handler protocols. Layered cover, probably. Your intelligence team is good, but the Corvin modification trail will move faster if you start with the array's power cell registration rather than the housing. Elena looked at him. I read equipment specification documents too, he said. She found to her own mild surprise that she was smiling. Not the careful, diplomatic version, the real one, brief and unguarded, which she was fairly certain he saw before she had decided whether to let him. He said nothing about it. He simply reached for his data slate, turned it over once in his hands, and set it back down. And in the easy, unhurried quiet that settled between them after that, Elena opened the file she had not been opening and looked at what was in it, and found it was considerably larger than she had accounted for. Velorn Citadel arrived the way significant places tend to arrive when you have been thinking about something else, suddenly, and with more presence than you had budgeted for. The navigation display gave a 15-minute warning that Elena registered and David acknowledged with a slight straightening. And then the corridor road curved around the last of the eastern ridge, and the Citadel was simply there, lit against the night in the particular way of places that have been important for a long time and know it. Elena had been to Velorn twice before, both times for summits, both times as the primary diplomatic principal, both times with the full architecture of preparation around her, briefing files, protocol schedules, the careful choreography of arrival that transforms a person into a position. This time the preparation was the same, but she felt it differently, which she attributed to the ambush and not to the 2 hours of corridor road that had preceded this moment. And if that attribution was not entirely accurate, she was a queen and entitled to her own filing system. The Citadel's receiving bay was lit with the blue-white of full-spectrum arrays, the kind that flattered no one and were therefore considered diplomatically neutral, and the reception detail was already arranged when the carriage door opened. Alina stepped out first, protocol, always protocol, the careful grammar of political life, and felt the Bayes climate system register her presence with a faint adjustment of temperature that was either very good engineering or very attentive staff. Probably both. Velorn had a reputation for both. The summit coordinator was a woman named Sable, compact and precise, who greeted Alina with the exact degree of formality the occasion required, and then looked at the carriage with an expression that processed several things in rapid sequence. There was a report of an incident on the Eastern Corridor, Sable said. There was an incident on the Eastern Corridor, Alina confirmed. Sable looked at David, then back at Alina. The detailed reports are already with our security office. Is there anything you require immediately? David said, would be genuinely appreciated. Sable blinked once, which was the Velorn equivalent of a dramatic reaction. Of course. The Citadel's interior was all clean lines and deliberate material choices, the architecture of a place built to contain disagreements without being affected by them. Alina had always found it faintly impressive. She walked through it now with the same composed pace she brought to every arrival, and was aware that something in her internal calibration had shifted since the last time she had walked through a corridor with David beside her. He moved through the Citadel the way he moved through most spaces, without requiring the space to accommodate him, adapting without appearing to adapt, which was either a personal quality or a trained one, and which she had placed in the file she was now keeping significantly more organized notes in. Their quarters were adjacent, as they always were for joint diplomatic stays. A sweet arrangement with a shared reception room that served as a buffer between the private and the professional. Alina had spent 14 months treating this arrangement as entirely architectural. She was revising the arrangement's significance in real time, which was not the most efficient use of her attention during a summit, and she was doing it anyway. The tea arrived before they had fully settled, which confirmed the attentive staff theory. David sat across from her in the reception room's formal chairs, less familiar than the carriage, more formal than breakfast, a setting without established choreography, and wrapped both hands around the cup with the same unhurried patience he applied to tea universally, as though the tea deserved to be held properly. The third delegation will know the ambush failed, Alina said. Within the hour, probably. That changes their position for tomorrow's session. It changes what they're willing to show of their position, he said, which isn't the same thing. Alina looked at him over her own cup. You've done diplomatic work before. Your file said border security consultation. Files say efficient things, he said, which was not evasive exactly. It had the quality of a true statement that had chosen its own borders carefully, and she recognized the technique because she used it herself with some regularity. I read your file before the wedding, she said. I know. You read mine. Yours was longer, he said. It took 2 evenings. I read the trade policy sections 3 times. He paused. They were interesting. Alina set her cup down. Outside the Citadel's viewport, Velorn's nightscape arranged itself with the patient indifference of geography, the signal towers blinking their slow, encrypted rhythms against the dark. She had been in this reception room configuration, formal chairs, diplomatic tea, the careful distance of professional adjacency, more times than she could usefully count, with advisors and delegates and heads of state. She was finding it a different room than it had been in all those prior instances. The power cell registration trace, she said. You worked that out in the carriage. Mostly. Show me. He looked at her for a moment, that look she was accumulating a taxonomy of, the ones that seemed to be doing quiet work behind their surface. Then he set down his cup, reached for the data slate on the side table, and moved his chair closer to hers with the simple practicality of someone who has decided that the distance between 2 chairs is a logistical problem and not a symbolic one. He pulled up the array schematic from the security report and began walking her through it. His reasoning was lateral in a way she found immediately engaging, not the straight line from evidence to conclusion, but the kind that checks the edges of things, that asks what the data would look like if the obvious interpretation were wrong. She interrupted twice with questions. He answered without the particular quality some people have of being surprised that you've asked something good. The third time she interrupted it was to correct a registration code he'd misread from the report's compressed format, and he looked at the correction, looked at her, and said, "Yes, that's better," in the tone of someone genuinely pleased to be wrong. Outside, the signal towers kept their slow rhythm. The tea went cool in the cups. In the shared reception room of Velorn's Citadel, with the third delegation recalculating somewhere in the same building and tomorrow's session already reshaping itself around the evening's events, Alina and David sat close enough that the data slate was readable to both of them, and worked. And the distance that had been a fixture of 14 months was quietly, without announcement, becoming a different kind of thing entirely. The summit began at the 9th hour by Velorn's station clock, which ran on a standardized interplanetary cycle that satisfied no one's natural rhythms and was therefore considered fair. Alina arrived at the session chamber with her delegation arranged precisely as protocol required, her briefing files current as of 40 minutes prior, and the kind of focused composure that 14 months of diplomatic marriage had taught her to maintain regardless of what was happening in the quieter parts of her attention. David was not part of the official delegation. He sat in the observer tier with the other accompanying personnel, advisors, security leads, the various functionaries that summits accumulate the way ships accumulate barnacles. And Alina did not look at the observer tier when she took her seat at the primary table, because looking at the observer tier was not something the primary diplomatic principal did during opening formalities, and she was the primary diplomatic principal, and formalities existed for good reasons. She looked at the observer tier once briefly during the reading of the session parameters. He was reading something. Of course he was. The third delegation arrived with the particular energy of people who had spent the night recalculating and had arrived at a position they considered defensible. Their lead representative was a man named Korath, careful, experienced, with the specific composure of someone who knows that the person across the table knows something about him and has chosen the tactic of proceeding as though they don't. Alina recognized it because she had used it herself. She found it less impressive from the other side of the table. The opening statements were formal and precisely meaningless in the way that opening statements always are, the diplomatic equivalent of two people sitting down at a table and acknowledging that there is a table. Alina delivered hers with the measured cadence she had spent years developing, and watched Korath deliver his, and catalogued 17 things about his word choices that she would examine during the recess. The session moved into the resource corridor parameters, which was where the real architecture of disagreement lived. The disputed zone was a stretch of interplanetary transit corridor that 3 different settlement systems claimed administrative rights over for 3 different historically valid reasons, which was the kind of problem that was either solved through genuine compromise or not solved at all, and merely managed into the next generation's inheritance. Alina had been managing it for 2 years. She intended to solve it today, which was either confidence or stubbornness, and she had long since stopped distinguishing between the two in herself. Korath introduced an amendment to the corridor partition proposal that was technically within the framework of the existing agreement and operationally designed to make it unworkable. Alina read it in 90 seconds, understood it in 91, and spent the next 4 minutes asking him careful, specific questions about it in the tone of someone seeking clarification, while making the structure of what she understood entirely visible to everyone at the table. It was one of her better techniques. Sable, observing from the facilitator's position, made a note on her slate. At the midday recess, Alina's delegation gathered in the side chamber to reassess. The atmosphere was the focused, slightly pressurized kind that good delegations generate when they are working at the edge of their preparation. Her trade advisor laid out 3 counterpositions. Her legal counsel flagged 2 procedural vulnerabilities in Korath's amendment. Alina listened to all of it and was composing her synthesis when the chamber door opened, and David appeared with a tray that held, improbably, a fresh pot of tea and a small plate of something that the Citadel kitchen had apparently decided constituted a working lunch. The delegation looked at the tray, then at David, then at Alina. The kitchen was concerned, he said, setting the tray down with the same unremarkable practicality he brought to everything, that the delegation had missed the formal lunch hour. There was some debate about whether to interrupt. I resolved the debate. Alina's legal counsel looked at the tea with the expression of someone who had been awake since the 5th hour and had strong feelings about hot beverages. Is that the Highland blend? It is. How did you get the Highland blend? The Citadel standard stock is the coastal variety. I asked, David said. There was a brief pause in which the delegation collectively processed this, and Alina's trade advisor, a practical woman who had served Alina for 9 years and was not easily impressed, poured herself a cup with the decisive energy of someone updating an assessment. Alina looked at David. He looked back at her with the expression she had been developing a taxonomy of, the one that had work going on behind it, and then he set a folded note on the table beside the tray and left the chamber with the same quality of exit he had, she was noticing, applied to the carriage door. Present, then resolved, then absent, without drama in any direction. She unfolded the note after a moment. It contained, in handwriting that was precise without being ornate, a single observation about Korath's amendment. Not the procedural vulnerabilities her legal counsel had flagged, but a different angle entirely. A clause in the original corridor agreement that the amendment's language had carefully avoided referencing, and which, if referenced directly in her counterproposal, would require Korath to either defend an inconsistency or abandon the amendment's operational intent entirely. Alina read it twice, then she looked at the closed door for a moment. He's right, her legal counsel said, reading over her shoulder with the complete absence of professional boundaries that 9 years of close work produces. That clause. If you anchor the counterproposal there. I know, Alina said. She picked up her own cup of tea, Highland blend, which was in fact considerably better than the coastal variety, and spent the remaining recess time building the counterproposal around the clause in question. And if she was also spending some portion of her attention on the folded note and what it represented, she was doing it with the quiet efficiency of someone who has decided that a thing deserves to be thought about properly, and is going to think about it properly regardless of the summit schedule's opinion on the matter. The afternoon session opened. Korath introduced his position with the careful confidence of the previous arrangement. Alina waited until he had finished, let the chamber settle, and then place the clause on the table the way you place something down when you know exactly how much it weighs. The expression on Korath's face went through several versions before arriving at something that was almost, Alina thought, respect. The corridor agreement was signed at the 17th hour by Velorn's station clock, which meant it was signed in the particular exhausted clarity that descends on people who have been solving a difficult thing for a long time and have finally solved it. Korath signed with the composure of someone who had lost the amendment but kept the larger negotiation, which was the correct read of the outcome and which Alina respected him for making. The 3 delegations filed out of the session chamber with the specific energy of concluded work. Not celebration exactly, more the quiet satisfaction of a weight that has been set down carefully rather than dropped. Sable caught Alina at the chamber door with the expression of someone who has been waiting to say something professional and is choosing her moment. The session outcome will be transmitted to all 3 capitals within the hour. The facilitating office's preliminary assessment is that the corridor partition framework is the most structurally sound agreement this dispute has produced in 11 years. 12, Alina said. Sable checked her slate. 12, yes. She paused in the way of someone adding something that is not in her notes. The clause your counter-proposal was anchored to. It wasn't in any of the briefing files. No, Alina agreed. It wasn't. Sable looked at her for a moment with the careful neutrality of a professional who has observed something and has decided that observing it is sufficient. Then she nodded and moved on with the efficiency of someone who has 17 other things requiring her attention, which she almost certainly did. Alina stood in the corridor for a moment after she had gone. Around her, the Citadel was doing what Citadels do after summits, the organized, purposeful movement of people returning to their ordinary orbits, the low current of conversation that follows concluded tension. Signal traffic would be moving between the three settlement systems already, the agreement propagating outward through the relay network in encrypted packets that would arrive at their destinations before the delegations arrived home. Somewhere in the intelligence infrastructure of all three systems, analysts were beginning the work of understanding what the outcome meant. Alina had spent 12 years contributing to outcomes that other people spent their careers analyzing, and she had always found this more satisfying than the analysis itself. She found David in the shared reception room, which had become, she noticed, a space she navigated toward rather than simply occupied. He was at the viewport, watching Velorn's nightscape with the same quality of attention he brought to things that interested him, which was the quality of not requiring them to be anything other than what they were. "It's done," she said. "I know." Sable's office sent a summary to all observatory personnel. He turned from the viewport. The clause worked. The clause worked. She sat down in one of the formal chairs, which felt less formal than it had the previous evening, and she did not think this was the chair's doing. Korath's legal team will have seen it within 30 seconds of my raising it. They spent 11 minutes in private consultation before he responded. 11 minutes is a long time at a summit table. It was a comfortable 11 minutes, she said, and found that she meant it in a way that extended beyond the session chamber. He sat down across from her. The tea service had been refreshed at some point by Citadel staff who had clearly absorbed the previous evening's preferences, because it was the Highland blend again, and Alina poured 2 cups with the ease of someone who has done this enough times that it has stopped being a gesture and become simply a thing that happens. She passed him one. He took it with both hands, which she had stopped finding unremarkable approximately 3 days ago. "The intelligence report on the ambush came through an hour ago," he said. "The power cell registration trace held. The array originated from a procurement contact in the outer settlement network. The third delegation's connection is indirect, 2 layers of contractor separation, but it's there. Korath will have known this was coming before he signed today. Probably. He signed anyway. The agreement is worth more to him than the ambush was," David said. "The ambush was about preventing the summit. The summit happened. He's a practical man." Alina considered this. "You read people the way you read specification documents." "Most people have specifications," he said. "They're just less clearly formatted." She looked at him across the 2 cups of Highland tea in the reception room of Velorn Citadel, and thought about 14 months of breakfast, and 440 mornings of accurate, complete knowledge that had not added up to understanding. She thought about a carriage window and 4 minutes, and a hand extended in bronze light with an expression that had not changed for any of it. She thought about a folded note and a clause that had not been in any briefing file, and 11 minutes of comfortable silence at a summit table, and the way he had moved his chair closer to hers the previous evening, with the simple practicality of someone solving a logistical problem. "I read your file before the wedding," she said. "I told you this yesterday." "You did." "I retained the relevant sections." "I assumed you had." "I did not retain," she said carefully, "the correct sections." He was quiet for a moment in the way that he was quiet, not emptily, not as an absence, but as a presence that was simply not using words. Outside the viewport, Velorn's signal towers kept their slow rhythm, the encrypted pulses moving outward into the dark in all directions, carrying the shape of what had been decided here to the systems and settlements that would be changed by it. The relay network would carry the agreement to 3 capitals before morning. It would carry the ambush report to her intelligence minister. It would carry the summit outcome to analysts who would spend weeks with it. None of this would carry what was in this room, which was not the kind of thing that moved through relay networks. The return journey, David said. Eastern route again, or the coastal pass. Elena picked up her cup. The coastal pass, she said. I haven't taken it before. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not with any of the grandeur the moment could have claimed for itself, but in the small, specific way of something settling into a new position. She recognized it because she felt it in herself, the same quiet rearrangement, the same sense of a variable that had been approximate becoming precise. The coastal pass has better signal coverage, he said, fewer blind spots. I know, she said. I read the route specification document this morning. He looked at her. Then he did something she had seen the structural suggestion of across 440 breakfasts, but not, until now, the full and actual version. He smiled. And it was unhurried and unguarded and entirely itself. And Elena held it in her attention with the care of someone who understands the value of a thing and intends to keep accurate records going forward. Outside, the signal towers blinked their patient rhythms. The Highland tea cooled slowly in 2 cups. The corridor agreement moved through the relay network toward 3 waiting capitals, and in the shared reception room of Velorn's citadel, a queen who had spent 14 months being careful discovered that she had not, in fact, been wrong to be careful. She had simply been careful about the wrong things, and was now prepared, with all the deliberate precision that was the most essentially herself thing about her, to begin being careful about the right ones.